see someone lose control, when we watch them break apart in ways that look sudden and shocking, we think we're witnessing the moment they went crazy. But here's what no one tells you. That moment, it's not the beginning, it's the end. The brutal truth is that going crazy doesn't happen in an instant. It happens slowly, quietly, over years of invisible wounds that nobody else can see. And if you really want to understand what it means when someone finally breaks, you need to look at everything that came before that moment. You need to see the brutal past that carved out the person who eventually went crazy. Think about a house that looks perfectly fine from the outside. Clean walls, fresh paint, strong foundation. But inside, the walls are crumbling. The foundation has cracks running through it like broken veins. The structure is barely holding itself together. That's what happens to a person before they go crazy. The damage happens on the inside, deep down, where nobody can see it. And by the time the house collapses, by the time everyone notices something's wrong, the destruction has already been happening for a very long time. Going crazy is the final chapter in a story that started years earlier. It's the last page of a book that was written in pain, in trauma, in wounds that never got a chance to heal. When you see someone who seems unstable, who seems unpredictable, who seems like they're losing their grip on reality, what you're really seeing is the result of a brutal past. You're seeing someone who's been fighting a war inside themselves for so long that they finally ran out of strength to keep fighting. Let's be clear about something from the start. Nobody is born crazy. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to lose their mind. The human brain is designed to survive, to adapt, to protect itself. But when that brain gets hurt over and over again, when it gets broken down piece by piece, it starts to change. It starts to defend itself in ways that look strange from the outside. It starts to build walls, create patterns, develop behaviors that are meant to keep the person safe. And those behaviors, to everyone else, they look like madness. But to the person living through it, they're survival. The brutal past of someone who goes crazy is usually filled with things that most people will never understand. It's filled with moments that cut deep, with experiences that left scars on the inside where nobody could see them. These aren't just bad days or tough times. These are experiences that change the way a person sees the world, change the way they see themselves, change the way their brain processes everything around them. Let's start with childhood, because for so many people who eventually break down, the story begins there. Imagine a child growing up in a home where love is conditional, where safety isn't guaranteed, where the people who are supposed to protect them are the same people who hurt them. That child learns very quickly that the world is not a safe place. They learn that trust is dangerous. They learn that showing vulnerability means getting hurt. And those lessons, they sink deep into the brain, into the nervous system, into the very core of who that person becomes. When a child grows up in chaos, their brain adapts to chaos. It learns to stay on high alert, constantly scanning for danger, constantly preparing for the next bad thing to happen. That child grows into an adult who can't relax, who can't trust, who sees threats everywhere even when they're not there. From the outside, people say that person is paranoid, that they're overreacting, that they're being irrational. But on the inside, that person is just doing what their brain learned to do a long time ago. They're trying to survive. Trauma in childhood doesn't just go away when someone gets older. It doesn't fade into the background like a bad memory. Instead, it becomes part of the foundation of who that person is. It shapes how they think, how they feel, how they relate to other people. And when that foundation is built on pain, on fear, on instability, everything that gets built on top of it becomes unstable too. But childhood trauma is just one piece of the puzzle. There are other ways that a brutal past can create the conditions for someone to eventually break. Think about repeated rejection. Think about someone who tries again and again to connect with other people, to be seen, to be valued, and every single time they get pushed away, every single time they get told they're not good enough, not interesting enough, not worthy of being loved. That kind of rejection doesn't just hurt in the moment. It accumulates. It builds up like poison in the system until the person starts to believe that there's something fundamentally wrong with them. When someone believes they're unlovable, when they believe they're worthless, their entire reality starts to shift. They start interpreting everything through that lens. A friend doesn't call back. It's because they're not worth calling. A relationship ends. It's because they're not worth staying for. A job doesn't work out. It's because they're not good enough at anything. And the more they think this way, the deeper they sink into a pit of self-hatred that becomes almost impossible to climb out of. This is where the brutal past starts to create the conditions for going crazy. Because when someone is drowning in self-hatred, when they're suffocating under the weight of their own perceived worthlessness, their mind starts to fracture. They start to disconnect from reality because reality is too painful to bear. They start to create alternate versions of themselves, alternate explanations for why things happen, alternate ways of seeing the world that make the pain slightly more bearable. And to everyone else, these alternate realities look like delusion. They look like madness. But to the person living through it, they're the only way to keep going. Let's talk about isolation too, because isolation is one of the most brutal parts of the past that leads to someone going crazy. Humans are social creatures. We're wired to connect, to belong, to be part of something bigger than ourselves. When someone is cut off from that connection, when they're alone day after day, week after week, year after year, something inside them starts to break down. The mind needs interaction, needs stimulation, needs the mirror of other people to understand itself. Without that mirror, the mind starts to turn inward in ways that become destructive. Imagine being alone with your thoughts for so long that you can't tell the difference between what's real and what's just your mind playing tricks on you. Imagine having nobody to talk to, nobody to check in with, nobody to remind you that you're not crazy, that your thoughts are just thoughts and not reality. That's what prolonged isolation does. It takes away the external reference points that help us stay grounded. It leaves us trapped inside our own heads, and our heads can become very dangerous places when there's nobody else around to pull us out. The brutal past of someone who goes crazy is also filled with loss. Not just the loss of people, though that's part of it, but the loss of hope, the loss of dreams, the loss of the future they thought they were going to have. Think about someone who had a clear vision of their life, who believed things were going to turn out a certain way, and then everything fell apart. The career they worked for collapsed. The relationship they built crumbled. The health they took for granted disappeared. One by one, the pieces of their life got taken away until they were left with nothing but the wreckage of what used to be. When someone loses everything they believed in, when all the anchors that kept them stable get ripped away, they start to drift. They lose their sense of purpose, their sense of direction, their sense of meaning. And without meaning, life becomes unbearable. The mind starts to search desperately for something to hold on to, some way to make sense of the senselessness. And sometimes, in that desperate search, the mind creates things that aren't there. It creates conspiracies, it creates persecution narratives, it creates grand explanations for why everything went wrong. Not because the person wants to be delusional, But because the alternative is accepting that life is random, that bad things happen for no reason, that there's no cosmic justice or fairness or meaning behind the suffering, and that acceptance is too painful for a wounded mind to bear, here's something else that's crucial to understand about the brutal past. It's not always made up of big, dramatic events. Sometimes the most brutal pasts are made up of small, constant wounds that never heal. Think about someone who grows up hearing subtle messages that they're not quite right, not quite enough. Someone who faces microaggressions day after day, tiny moments of disrespect or dismissal or invalidation that seem too small to complain about, but add up over time into something massive. Those tiny wounds never get acknowledged, never get treated, never get validated. Instead, they accumulate in silence until the person carrying them can't carry them anymore. This is why going crazy often looks so inexplicable to the people on the outside. They see someone who seems to have had a decent life, someone who didn't experience any major trauma, someone who should be fine. But what they don't see are the 1,000 small cuts that bled internally. They don't see the constant invalidation, the subtle rejection, the quiet erosion of self-worth that happen behind closed doors and inside the person's own mind. The brutal past also includes the coping mechanisms that stopped working. Because here's the thing. Most people who eventually go crazy were actually incredibly strong for a very long time. They found ways to cope with their pain, to manage their trauma, to keep functioning despite everything they were carrying. Maybe they threw themselves into work. Maybe they used substances to numb the pain. Maybe they built elaborate mental frameworks to make sense of their suffering. Whatever they did, it worked for a while. It kept them afloat. But coping mechanisms have a shelf life. Eventually, they stop working. The work stops being fulfilling and starts being exhausting. The substances stop numbing and start destroying. The mental frameworks stop making sense and start collapsing. And when those coping mechanisms fail, when the strategies that kept someone functioning for years suddenly stop working, that's when the real breakdown begins. That's when all the pain that was being held back comes flooding in at once. That's when going crazy stops being a threat and starts being a reality. Now we're at the point where everything that's been building starts to reach its peak. All the trauma, all the wounds, all the unhealed pain, all the failed coping mechanisms, they all converge into a crisis point. This is where the internal battle that's been going on for years finally becomes visible to the outside world. This is where the person can no longer hold it together, can no longer pretend everything's fine, can no longer keep the darkness contained. The breakdown, the moment of going crazy, is actually the moment when all the invisible suffering becomes visible. It's when the internal collapse finally shows itself on the outside. And here's what makes this so tragic. By the time people notice, by the time they see that something's wrong, the person has already been suffering for so long that they're completely depleted. They've already used up all their strength just trying to survive. They've already fought battles that nobody else knew were happening. And now, when they finally need help the most, they're at their weakest. The crisis looks different for different people. For some, it's a complete withdrawal from reality. They stop being able to distinguish between what's real and what's not. Their mind creates elaborate alternate realities as a way to escape the unbearable pain of the real world. For others, it's explosive anger and aggression. Years of suppressed rage finally bursting out in ways that seem shocking and violent. For others still, it's a complete shutdown. A catatonic state where the mind and body simply stop functioning because they've reached the absolute limit of what they can endure. But regardless of how the breakdown manifests, the core truth remains the same. This isn't random. This isn't someone just losing their mind for no reason. This is the inevitable result of a brutal past that never got addressed, never got healed, never got acknowledged. This is what happens when someone carries too much pain for too long, with too little support. And here's where we need to shift our understanding completely. Because the narrative that society tells us about people who go crazy is wrong. We're told that mental breakdown is a sign of weakness, that it's a personal failure, that it's something shameful that needs to be hidden and fixed as quickly as possible. But that's not what it is at all. Going crazy, having a mental breakdown, losing your grip on reality, these aren't signs of weakness. They're signs that someone has been incredibly strong for far too long. They're signs that someone has endured things that would have broken most people much sooner. The breakdown isn't the failure. The breakdown is what happens when someone has been succeeding at surviving impossible circumstances for years and finally runs out of the superhuman strength it took to keep going. Think about it this way. If you take a piece of metal and you bend it over and over again, it will eventually break. But the breaking isn't because the metal was weak. It's because the metal was subjected to forces that exceeded its capacity to withstand them. The same is true for the human mind. When a mind breaks down, it's not because that mind was defective or weak. It's because that mind was subjected to forces, to pain, to trauma that exceeded its capacity to process and integrate. The person who goes crazy is not the problem. The brutal past that created the conditions for the breakdown is the problem. The lack of support, the lack of acknowledgement, the lack of healing resources, those are the problems. The person who finally breaks is just the visible symptom of a much deeper issue that society refuses to look at. Here's another truth that needs to be understood. The behaviors that look crazy, that look irrational, that look like madness to the outside world, they actually make perfect sense when you understand the brutal past that created them. Every delusion, every paranoid thought, every disconnection from reality, it all serves a psychological function. It's all the mind's attempt to protect itself from pain that's too overwhelming to face directly. When someone believes that people are out to get them, it's often because people have been out to get them in the past. When someone can't trust anyone, it's because they've been betrayed by people they trusted. When someone creates alternate realities where they have power and control, it's because their real life has left them feeling completely powerless. These aren't random symptoms, these are adaptations. These are the mind's creative attempts to survive in conditions that are fundamentally unsurvivable. And this is where awareness becomes so important. Because when we understand that going crazy is the end result of a brutal past, when we understand that the breakdown is actually the culmination of years of invisible suffering, we can start to approach these situations with compassion instead of judgment. We can start to see the person behind the symptoms. We can start to ask not what's wrong with them, but what happened to them. The brutal past doesn't excuse harmful behaviors. It doesn't mean that people who are struggling don't need to take responsibility for their actions. But it does mean that we need to expand our understanding of why people break down. It means we need to recognize that mental health crises aren't personal failings. They're human responses to inhuman circumstances. When we look at someone who's going crazy and we only see the surface behaviors, we miss the entire story. We miss the years of pain that led to this moment. We miss the countless times that person tried to hold it together, tried to ask for help, tried to keep going despite everything working against them. We miss the brutal truth that this breakdown could have been prevented if that person had gotten the support, the validation, the healing resources they needed before they reached the breaking point. The complexity of human suffering is something we tend to avoid as a society. It's easier to label someone as crazy and move on than it is to sit with the uncomfortable truth that their breakdown represents. It's easier to see mental illness as a medical problem that needs medication than it is to acknowledge the brutal social, emotional, and psychological conditions that create mental illness in the first place. But if we really want to help people who are struggling, if we really want to prevent these breakdowns before they happen, we need to get comfortable with complexity. We need to understand that healing isn't just about fixing symptoms. It's about addressing the brutal past that created those symptoms. It's about creating safety for people who have never felt safe. It's about providing connection for people who have been isolated. It's about validating pain that has been dismissed and denied for years. Going crazy is not the end of someone's story. With the right support, with genuine compassion, with resources and time and patience, people can come back from the brink. They can integrate their brutal past into their present without being destroyed by it. They can learn to live with their wounds in ways that don't require breaking down. But that healing is only possible when we stop seeing the breakdown as the problem and start seeing it as a symptom of problems that run much deeper. The person who goes crazy is telling us something through their breakdown. They're telling us that they've reached their limit. They're telling us that the pain has become unbearable. They're telling us that they need help in ways they couldn't ask for when they were still holding it together. And if we can hear that message, if we can see past the frightening surface behaviors to the wounded human underneath, we have a chance to actually help instead of just judging. The brutal past of someone who goes crazy is a story of survival against impossible odds. It's a story of a human being who endured more than any person should have to endure, who fought battles that nobody else could see, who kept going long past the point where most people would have given up. The breakdown isn't the weakness. The breakdown is what happens when someone has been strong for so long that their strength finally runs out. And there is no shame in that. There is only the tragedy of a person who needed help long before they reached the point of breaking. So the next time you see someone who appears to be losing their grip on reality, before you judge, before you label, before you dismiss them as crazy, take a moment to wonder about their brutal past. Wonder about what they've survived. Wonder about what they've carried. Wonder about the invisible wounds that finally became too heavy to bear. Because behind every person who goes crazy is a story of pain that deserves to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be met with compassion instead of condemnation. And maybe, just maybe, if we start paying attention to those stories before people break, we can create a world where fewer people have to go crazy just to make their suffering visible. That's the real lesson here. Going crazy isn't a personal failure. It's a collective failure. It's what happens when we as a society fail to see people's pain until it becomes impossible to ignore. It's what happens when we fail to provide support until someone is already broken. It's what happens when we treat human suffering as an individual problem, instead of recognizing our shared responsibility to create conditions where people can heal before they shatter. If this exploration into the hidden story behind mental breakdown has shifted something in how you see people who are struggling, if it's opened your eyes to the brutal past that shapes the visible present, then take that awareness and do something with it. Be the person who sees pain before it becomes crisis. Be the person who offers support before someone reaches their breaking point. Be the person who understands that we're all just trying to survive our own brutal pasts. And some of us need more help than others to make it through intact. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this perspective. Hit that like button if this changed how you see mental health struggles, and subscribe for more content that looks beneath the surface to find the deeper truth. Thanks for watching, and remember, compassion changes everything.